This video is brought to you by NordVPN. Give yourself options online. Go to nordvpn.com/biographics or use code biographics for a huge discount on a 2-year plan, plus an additional bonus month for free. More on them in just a bit. Every so often, an author comes along whose work defines a generation. Guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald in the 1920s or Ken Casey in the psychedelic 60s. But perhaps none has done such a profound job of shaping young people's lives as Jack Kerouac. As leading light of the beats, Kerouac championed a breathless prose that was lyrical in its intensity. His most famous book, On the Road, used a rhythm of jazz to capture the experience of travel, of sex, of wild parties and dive bars. Perhaps more than any other book, it opens the eyes of millions to a new way of being, of life outside the American mainstream. Yet there was far more to Kerouac than just youthful rebellion. Already in his 30s when On the Road came out, Kerouac would spend the rest of his life bitter about the way that his work was classified. Rather than a simple traveler, he saw himself as a modern Catholic mystic, as writing not just autobiography, but a way of reaching some deep spiritual truth. Misunderstood in both life and death, this is the story of Jack Kerouac, the writer who inspired a generation. For the author of a book as wholly American as On the Road, Kerouac spent a large part of his childhood defiantly outside of the American mainstream. Born into an immigrant community of Quebecois in Lowell, Massachusetts on March 12, 1922, Jack didn't learn to speak English until he started school. In fact, his birth name wasn't even Jack. His French-speaking parents, Leo and Gabrielle, christened him Jean-Louis Lebris de Kerouac. Nor was it only language that made the Kerouacs outsiders. Their home was the 1920s Quebecois ideal, tight-knit, devoutly Catholic, and steeped in ideas of suffering and penance. This faith would be a constant theme in Kerouac's recollections of his childhood, including both memories of church and the red afternoon in dead frozen winter when he realized he had a soul. But the sharpest memory would also be the most traumatic. All his short life, Kerouac's older brother Gerard was ill and venerated by their mother as a saint. When the boy died when Kerouac was just 4, they said that he slipped away after having a vision of the Virgin Mary. The pain of Gerard's passing and the religious experience that accompanied it would have a profound impact on Jack's writing. The rest of Kerouac's childhood was spent mostly on his two great loves, reading and sports. Embarrassed by his accented English, Kerouac rarely spoke at school until he was a teen, preferring instead to immerse himself in stories. When he was a child, he decided he wanted to write the great American novel. But really, any literary pretensions were just background noise to sports. From the moment he first stepped onto a football field, age 13, Kerouac was in love with the game. He was good at it too, so good that he looked like he might be able to get a scholarship. In those desperate times, this thought was a lifesaver. Once a semi-successful print shop owner, Leo Kerouac had been wiped out by the Great Depression and turned to alcohol. Although Gabrielle took work in a factory to make ends meet, the family was dirt poor. If he wanted to support his folks, Kerouac needed to get an education. So it was in 1939 that the boy headed to NYC on a football scholarship. For someone who'd grown up in Lowell, New York was like suddenly discovering the joys of haute cuisine after a life of only eating white bread. NYC in 1939 was the biggest city on the planet. The possibilities for experiences, for meeting people, for just living were endless. But the thing that would have the biggest impact on young Jack would be jazz. Introduced to the smoky nightclubs of Harlem, Kerouac finally found the music that stirred his soul. When it came time to write his novels, it would be the improvisational style, the rhythms of jazz that he aimed to capture in his words. But first, he'd have to ditch the sports. In 1940, Kerouac entered Columbia on his football scholarship, only to break his leg in one of his first games. When his coach benched him for an entire season, he flew into a rage, impulsively dropped out, and declared that he was going to become a writer. As any aspiring novelist will tell you, that's much, much easier to say than to do. In 1944, Kerouac was still drifting around the edges of student life at Columbia, still trying to make his name. The previous 4 years had seen him do everything from joining the construction crew, building the Pentagon, to sailing with the Merchant Marines, to signing up to fight in World War II and getting discharged after only 10 days. He'd also written his first novel, The Sea is My Brother, a book so bad Kerouac himself dismissed it as a crock. But hey, at least he'd made some interesting friends. Come 1944, Kerouac was palling around with future household names, Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs, lounging around hip bars, getting drunk and talking about poetry. It was an interesting life, one that brought him into contact with both junkie hustlers like Herbert Hung, who coined the term Beat Generation, and rich, respectable girls like Eddie Parker, who Jack started dating. It was also a life that led Kerouac to question a lot of things, not least his sexuality. As literary movements go, the Beats were a surprisingly queer one, with both Ginsberg and Burroughs being openly gay. The same can't be said of Kerouac, who would marry 3 women in his lifetime, but he had bisexual urges that would one day lead him to seducing Gore Vidal. In summer of 1944, though, the subject of those urges was Lucien Carr. Young and pretty, Carr caught the eye of plenty of men around NYC. But he was also unstable, an instability that boiled over when he stabbed a mutual friend of Kerouac and Burroughs to death. In the wake of the attack, Carr came to Kerouac for help. Together, they disposed of the bloody knife down a storm drain. Unfortunately, Carr then confessed to the killing, and Jack was arrested as an accessory to murder. Unable to make bail, his parents refusing to help, Jack turned to Eddie Parker. Her parents agreed to pay on the condition that the pair get married. On August 22nd, 1944, Kerouac was marched from the Bronx prison to the municipal building where he and Eddie tied the knot. He was then marched straight back under armed guard. Luckily, he wouldn't be in prison much longer. Carr's defense, and to this day no one knows if it was true or an alibi, was that he killed his victim after the man sexually assaulted him. Inclined to believe that a dead homosexual man was a good homosexual, the police didn't do much digging. Carr went down for just 18 months and Kerouac was freed. Short as Kerouac's time in jail was, it did have 2 significant effects. The first was that he and Burroughs collaborated on a book about their experience, and the hippos were boiled in their tanks. Unreleased in their lifetimes, it nonetheless stands as Kerouac's first serious attempt at tackling a novel. The second is that it led to Jack's marriage to Eddie, and that's important because it would be the high-speed breakdown of this marriage that pushed Kerouac to do something that he'd never done before: to go on the road. By rights, 1947 should have been an abysmal year for Jack Kerouac. His father had died a few months back, his marriage was coming apart, and his new novel, The Town and the City, was taking ages to write. But it's often at our lowest that we find inspiration, the drive to do something new and exciting. For Kerouac, that inspiration came in the form of one man, Neal Cassady. Born on February 8, 1926, Cassady was the sort of character you could never hope to write. Orphaned at a young age, he'd become a notorious petty criminal in Denver, stealing hundreds of cars and being sent in and out of reform school. But he was also a formidable autodidact, a guy who'd read all the philosophy texts in the public library, consumed great literature, and now talked in an amazing mix of high-flown phrases and back-alley slang. Everyone who met him was fascinated by him, from Allen Ginsberg, who'd started a sexual relationship with Cassady, to Ken Casey. In 1947, it was Kerouac's turn to have his mind blown. Their first meeting was typical Cassady. After hearing about this wild new guy in town, Jack went to call on him in East Harlem, only for Cassady to open the door stark naked. Just a few months later, Kerouac followed him back to Denver, abandoning his crumbling marriage to hitchhike across America, determined to get to know the strange new man in his life. It was the start of the frantic travels that would form the backbone of On the Road. It was also the start of by far the most significant friendship in Kerouac's life. In the months and years that he spent on and off traveling with Cassady, Kerouac came to see him as anything from a long-lost brother to an idealized version of himself to a potential lover. In short, Cassady became his muse, the two of them traveling together to California, to Mexico, to all sorts of places that Jack would later immortalize in prose. But don't go thinking it was some big, hedonistic adventure. On the Road's reputation is a book about young, carefree spirits breaking out of stuffy, conformist society to find freedom through travel. Just look at the Instagram-ready 2012 movie. In reality, a whole lot of those 3 years it was based on were spent in poverty and misery. A beat lifestyle was meant to mean both being beat down and poor, but also beatific in a Catholic sense, able to find God through suffering. It was this later concept that Kerouac developed most fully. He even called his most famous novel really the story of two Catholic buddies roaming the country in search of God. Key to that search was suffering, and boy, was there ever a lot of it. Kerouac would later recount being dirt poor on the West Coast, having to scrounge cigarettes off the grounds and not even being able to afford a bread roll. Others had even darker memories. Cassady's first wife, Lou Ann Henderson, was just 16 when she found herself having to nurse the grown Kerouac through an all-night crying jag in some desolate hotel. Speaking of Henderson, much of Kerouac and Cassady's travels were only made possible by them effectively abandoning their wives and, in Cassady's case, kids, for long stretches. So forget your misconceptions about On the Road being a chronicle of youthful freedom. In reality, it documented 3 years of fairly miserable, semi-religious wandering interspersed with a few lively parties and a lot of sexual experimentation. Difficult as those years may have been, though, they did furnish Kerouac with the inspiration that he needed. As early as October 1947, it decided he wanted to write a story about two men hitchhiking east, just as he and Cassidy had done. It would take several more years and a whole lot more suffering before that idea became the novel that would make his name. Now, if you don't want to wait several years for a secure internet experience, it's time to check out today's video sponsor, NordVPN. Look guys, it's not the 1990s, it's time to bring your internet experience up to the present day. VPNs aren't just a more modern way to use the internet, they're just straight up better. And with NordVPN, I can rest easy knowing that my internet use is safe behind a wall of next-generation encryption. Block malware and bypass annoying ads that are tracking your web traffic. It's just a more secure experience online. You're worried about data logs? Well, don't be. NordVPN doesn't keep logs on your internet use because they know where you go is none of their business. What they do give you is more than 5,000 server options scattered across 59 countries, so your IP can live wherever you want it to. And that can provide access to loads of new options from shopping to streaming. Just one click and you're good to go. So regardless of whether you're considering a VPN for yourself or as a gift for another internet user in your life, Nord gives you options. And right now, you guys can take advantage of a special deal that NordVPN is running. Any purchase of a 2-year plan comes with a huge discount, plus an additional month for free. And if you make a purchase and decide a VPN isn't for you, NordVPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. Look, there's never been a better time to enhance your online experience with NordVPN. So head to nordvpn.com/Biographics, or just use the code Biographics at checkout, or just follow the link in the description box below. And let's get back to Jack. A big part of the mythology of On the Road is that Kerouac wrote it in 3 weeks flat. While that's technically true, it ignores the years of hard work that went into getting to that moment. When Kerouac first started what was then Gone on the Road, he still thought of himself as a literary writer. That meant carefully crafted sentences, characters who were symbols, intricate plotting. It also meant a hell of a boring book. The boys hitchhiking east were the grandchildren of characters in a great family saga. They were half-brothers trying to woo the same girl. In other words, Kerouac had no idea what they were or what his novel really was. While his notebook and diary were starting to show the rapid lyrical prose he'd soon be famous for, his great American novel was a leaden tome more likely to kill teenagers with boredom than inspire them. That it ever evolved into something readable is thanks entirely to Cassidy. Since they met back in 1947, Kerouac had been convinced that Cassidy was a great writer who needed to find his voice. He encouraged him to write letters, sketches, whatever came to his mind. In December 1950, Cassidy finally produced the masterpiece that Kerouac had dreamed of. The Joan Anderson letter was a 40-page confessional that recorded every single one of Cassidy's affairs in unvarnished detail. It had clearly been written in a rush without much thought for the niceties of literature, and it transformed Kerouac's life. Compelled to write an instant, unvarnished reply of his own, Kerouac dashed off his confessional letter, sending it back to Cassidy as soon as it was finished. It was in that mad rush of his reply that Jack finally cracked it. How he wanted to write. How he'd always wanted to write. The rest of the pieces quickly fell into place. Helping clean out the apartment of a recently deceased friend, Kerouac stumbled across a stack of architecture paper. Taking it home, he taped the whole lot together, creating one giant scroll. By spring 1951, Jack was writing like mad in his notebooks, jotting memories of his travels, all with the free-flowing energy that he'd found writing to Cassidy. He was even creating a new rhythm to accompany it, one which flowed like jazz, with normal punctuation replaced by dashes, signifying when to breathe. Ginsberg would later call this spontaneous bot prosody. Kerouac would claim, with only a hint of irony, that it was the work of the Holy Ghost. The last piece of the puzzle landed in March 1951. That day, beat writer John Cleland Holmes showed Kerouac his manuscript for Go, an autobiographical retelling of their lives. Outraged that some young punk had beaten him to it, Kerouac decided that he had to write his novel now or risk being an also-ran. On the evening of April 2nd, 1951, he fed his scroll of architecture paper into his typewriter and poured a bathtub-sized mug of coffee. What he typed next is the stuff of legend. Kerouac wrote for 20 days straight, hitting 6,000 words a day at first before picking up speed. Words tumbled from recollections, images, moments spent traveling America with Neil Cassidy brought to life again on the page. The more Kerouac wrote, the more his style matured, giving way from terse Hemingway sentences to mad, flowing paragraphs. By the end, the scroll itself resembled a road, 120 feet long and winding across the floor. It was a feat of endurance equal to anything Jack had ever achieved on the football field. The creation of not just an autobiographical story, but an American myth. Now he just had to find someone who'd buy the damn thing. On April the 22nd, 1951, Robert Giraud got a strange call. It was Jack Kerouac, whose novel The Town and the City Giraud had edited. The writer was raving that he had a masterpiece, one that he needed to show him. Shortly after, Kerouac swaggered into Giraud's office and unfurled the scroll across the floor. "Here it is," he shouted, "written by the Holy Ghost." By now, the scroll was battered beyond belief, knocked about when Kerouac broke up with his second wife and moved in with Lucien Carr, then chewed up around the edges by Carr's dog. But Kerouac didn't care. He was ecstatic, certain he'd made a literary breakthrough. He was even talking about having it published in scroll format. In shock, Giraud told him making this mess readable was going to take a ton of editing. Kerouac's response? Well, he told Giraud, "You have offended the Holy Ghost," and stormed out of his office and never worked with him again. If that sounds like a slight overreaction, remember to put this in the context of Kerouac's religion. When Kerouac said On the Road was written by the Holy Ghost, he was being at least half serious. With his new style, he'd come to believe revision was a form of lying or stripping away the brief, ecstatic glimpse of spiritual truth that writing could afford. If the trance-like state of writing was communion with the Catholic God, then editing wasn't just an attack on his ego, it was practically a sin. It's this attitude that probably explains why On the Road took so long to appear in print. All through the first half of the 50s, Kerouac's friends were sending the scroll to publishers, trying to stir interest. They even got Kerouac to grouchily retype it on regular paper to make it easier for editors to read. But as 1951 gave way to 1952, a strange thing happened. Kerouac gave up on his novel. By the new year, Kerouac was writing other books based on the same trips, using an even purer style of composition. The Subterraneans was written on a 3-day amphetamine bender, while Visions of Cody had sections more like poetry. The more Kerouac matured, the greater religious ecstasy he came to receive from writing, until he regarded On the Road as a mere transition, something that paved the way for his newer work. He was also traveling again, expanding his horizons, getting drawn into Buddhism, a religion Ginsberg thought Jack responded to because of its emphasis on the Catholic-like suffering of existence that is so deep that it is joyful. In fact, Kerouac had pretty much forgotten the scroll when he got a call in 1955 and discovered Viking was willing to take a chance on publishing it. But they were going to need major changes. What followed was a torturous 2-year back and forth as Kerouac tried to cling on to his original vision, while Viking tried to get a book that they could actually sell. At long last, desperately broke and in need of cash, Kerouac agreed to let the editors make changes. They didn't give him a chance to approve their edits, just chopped out all the realistic descriptions of sex, changed the names, broke up the long sentences that contained the book's music. That September, a butchered version of On the Road hit the bookshelves, but it still had enough of Kerouac to cause a sensation. Just after midnight on September 5th, 1957, Kerouac stood with his girlfriend, Joyce Johnson, and read Gilbert Milstein's review in the New York Times. Just as, more than any other novel of the 20s, The Sun Also Rises came to be regarded as the testament of the lost generation, so it seems certain that On the Road will come to be known as that of the Beat generation. In shock, Kerouac asked Johnson if that was a good review or not. She assured him that it was. As Johnson later put it, when they both went to bed that night, Kerouac was obscure. By the time he woke up the next morning, he'd be famous. Okay, so we've just seen Kerouac publish his bestseller, aged 35. There must still be a hell of a long way to go in this video, right? Well, sadly, no. This is it. This is the final chapter, the last part to tell. That's because within a year of On the Road's publication, Kerouac would suffer a life-changing injury. Within 4 years, he'd have published the last of his best-known books. By the time the late 1960s rolled around, he'd be broke, addicted to alcohol, and on the verge of a painful death. So buckle up, because it's all downhill from here. The moment On the Road landed, Kerouac became a literary superstar, a household name for millions, inspired by his work, but also a target for relentless mockery. Truman Capote, for example, famously dismissed Kerouac's prose as typing, not writing. But the worst part of being famous was being recognized. In April 1958, a gang of drunks noticed Kerouac drinking in a crappy bar. They attacked him, beat him unconscious, smacking his head repeatedly against the sidewalk. Although Kerouac was cleared for concussion, he later came to suspect that he'd suffered brain damage. Certainly his life post-1958 is characterized by behavior linked to head injury, depression, memory loss, poor impulse control, substance abuse. And it would explain a whole lot of what came next. By the early 1960s, Kerouac was increasingly turning to drink to cope with the pressures of fame, to cope with his recurrent depression. He still found time to write, putting out his last great novel, Big Sur, in 1961, but already his work was sliding towards irrelevance. In 1962, Neal Cassady showed up at the door of Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, beginning his time with the Merry Pranksters. Interested in LSD, psychedelics, and freeing their minds, the Pranksters would soon help kickstart a whole new youth movement, one that would quickly make the beatniks look as relevant as yuppies do today: the hippies. Not that hippie culture had no time for the beats, though. Both Ginsberg and Cassady became fully paid-up members of the movement, and a whole bunch of hippies were inspired by On the Road. But Kerouac sure as hell had no time for them. As someone who'd served his country in the Merchant Marines, Kerouac was disgusted by what he saw as the counterculture's anti-Americanism. The more guys like Kesey trampled on the flag, the more Kerouac moved away from their movement. And that would have been fine if only he had something to move on to. As it was, he only had drink. Come the late 1960s, Kerouac's alcohol problem had gone beyond merely problematic and become something that was eating him alive. Although he'd married his third wife, Stella, he'd also become prone to mood swings and outbursts of violence. He'd broken off contact with Ginsberg and Burroughs over perceived slights. He'd turned into a recluse, living in poverty with only his mum and Stella for company. He became obsessed with conspiracy theories, that Neal Cassady hadn't really died in 1968, that communists and Jews were controlling America's youth. You can see the allure of the brain damage theory. 1969 Kerouac was so different from 1958 Kerouac that it just demands an explanation. But maybe there's no need to look beyond the simplest explanation of all. Like his father before him, Kerouac had slipped deep into alcoholism. There was nothing left in his life but getting drunk and ranting about the world. When your only coping mechanism is to take a drink, it's inevitable that eventually the drink will take you. Alcohol finally killed Jack Kerouac on the 21st of October 1969. Aged just 47, Kerouac died bitter and alone, his books nearly all out of print, half forgotten by the culture that had embraced him just a decade before. It was a miserable end, a fate no one deserves. But of course, it wasn't really the end. Today, Kerouac is part of the American canon. Millions still read his work, not just On the Road, but also Dharma Bums, Desolation Angels, and more. And millions are inspired by it to change their lives. It's a fitting legacy for Kerouac to end up an icon, but it's also a legacy that misses out on an important part of Kerouac's story. Here was a man who wasn't just a rebel, but an experimental writer who tried to put on paper what was happening at a specific point in US history. The experience of blue-collar Catholic youth at a time of great social change. In embracing both the real and spiritual, he created books that refuse to be classified, that are at once travelogues, novels, religious texts, and autobiography, but never anything less than fascinating. The man behind them may have died forgotten and unloved, but his work will continue to resonate for decades to come. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.